The morning of July 28, 1944 broke grey and humid over the hedgerows of Normandy. Staff Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 2nd Armoured Division knelt in the mud beside his disabled Sherman tank, running his fingers along a jagged tear in the hull where an 88mm shell had punched through like paper. The metal was still warm. Inside, 3 men he'd eaten breakfast with that morning would never eat again. Around him, in the fields and sunken lanes of the Bocage country, 23 other American tanks sat silent and smoking, victims of an enemy they rarely saw before the killing shot arrived. The Germans called their heavy tanks Tigers. The Americans had other names for them, none of which could be printed in the letters home. But on this particular morning, watching a French blacksmith named Jacques repair a farm gate with salvaged German steel, Culin had an idea that would change the way America fought its war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem facing the American armoured divisions in the summer of 1944 was not a secret. It was discussed in after-action reports, whispered about in foxholes, and occasionally acknowledged in the carefully worded dispatches sent back to Washington. The M4 Sherman medium tank, the backbone of American armoured forces, was outmatched by German heavy armour in almost every measurable way. A Tiger, the first heavy tank mounting an 88mm gun, could destroy a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Sherman's 75mm gun, firing standard armour-piercing ammunition, could not reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour, even at point-blank range. The mathematics of this mismatch were brutal and simple. American tank commanders knew them by heart because their lives depended on understanding them. The standard doctrine, taught at Fort Knox and repeated in training manuals distributed throughout the European theatre, advised Sherman crews to use their superior numbers and mechanical reliability to overwhelm German heavy tanks through maneuver and coordinated fire. The unofficial translation of this doctrine, as understood by the men who actually had to execute it, was equally simple. It took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, and 4 of those Shermans would burn before the job was done. The crews called their tanks Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because of their tendency to ignite when penetrated. They called them Tommy Cookers for the same reason. They called them a lot of things, but none of those names reflected confidence or affection. Yet the problem Curtis Culin faced on that July morning was not primarily about the Sherman's gun or its armour, though both were inadequate against German heavy tanks. The crisis that had paralysed the American advance through Normandy was more fundamental and more frustrating. The Sherman tank, designed for rapid movement across open terrain, had been thrust into a landscape for which it was catastrophically unsuited. The hedgerows of Normandy, called bocage by the French who had cultivated them for centuries, were not simple fences or decorative borders. They were ancient earthen walls, sometimes 8 feet high, topped with centuries of densely packed thorned vegetation and roots. These walls divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small, irregular fields, each one a potential killing ground, each hedgerow a ready-made fortification. When a Sherman attempted to cross a hedgerow using its engine power and weight, the tank's nose would rise upward, exposing the thin armour of its belly to any German anti-tank weapon positioned in the next field. For a few critical seconds, the Sherman was immobilised and vulnerable, its treads churning air while its crew waited helplessly for the shot they knew was coming. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, had quickly learned to position their anti-tank guns to exploit this weakness. They would allow American tanks to begin their climb over the hedgerow, wait for the belly armour to present itself, and fire at leisure. The result was a slaughter that threatened to stall the entire Normandy campaign. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army in Normandy, later admitted in his memoirs that the hedgerow problem had brought the American advance to what he called a grinding, costly crawl. In the 6 weeks following the D-Day landings, American forces had advanced barely 30 miles inland. The casualty rates were approaching those of the First World War. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly, because the entire strategic plan for liberating France depended on American armor breaking out of the bocage and into the open country beyond. The official response to the hedgerow crisis came through proper channels. Army engineers experimented with explosive charges that could blow gaps through the earthen walls. Bulldozer tanks were shipped from England, specially equipped to push through or over the obstacles. Both solutions worked, after a fashion, but both were slow, required specialized equipment that was in short supply, and still left the tanks vulnerable during the crucial moments of crossing. What the army needed was a solution that every tank could carry, that required no special training, and that would allow Shermans to punch through hedgerows quickly without exposing their belly armor. What they needed was exactly the kind of innovation that bureaucratic military organizations rarely produce and almost never produce quickly. Curtis Culin was not an engineer, though he had worked in his father's garage in New Jersey before the war. He was not an armor expert, though he had commanded a Sherman tank through North Africa and Sicily. He was a 26-year-old staff sergeant who was tired of watching friends die because their cloth tanks couldn't cross a dirt wall. And on the morning of July 28th, watching a French blacksmith cut through a section of German steel obstacle with an acetylene torch, Culin realized that the enemy had already provided the raw materials for the solution. The fields and beaches of Normandy were littered with German steel obstacles, the infamous Czech hedgehogs, and Belgian gates that had been installed as part of the Atlantic Wall defences. These obstacles were made from high-quality steel, cut into sections, and welded into crosses and gates designed to rip the hulls from landing craft and impale attacking infantry. After the successful invasion, thousands of tons of these steel obstacles now lay abandoned across the Norman countryside, serving no purpose except as monuments to German defensive paranoia. Culin looked at the steel. He looked at his Sherman, and he began to sketch in the mud. The design he conceived was almost primitive in its simplicity. 4 steel prongs, shaped like tusks or teeth, would be welded to the front of the Sherman's hull. When the tank approached a hedgerow, instead of climbing up and over the obstacle, the steel prongs would bite into the earthen wall at ground level. The tank's weight and engine power would drive the prongs forward, cutting through the roots and earth rather than climbing over them. The Sherman would stay level, keeping its belly armor protected, and would burst through the hedgerow with enough momentum to surprise and overwhelm any German defensive position on the other side. The entire crossing would take seconds rather than minutes, and most importantly, every Sherman in the division could be equipped with these prongs using materials already available in the combat zone. Culin took his sketch to his company commander, then to the battalion maintenance officer. The initial response was polite skepticism. Field modifications to tank armor were technically prohibited without approval from higher headquarters. The addition of weight to the front of the tank might affect its balance and maneuverability. There were concerns about whether the hull welds could support the additional stress. There were, in short, all the reasonable objections that a properly functioning military bureaucracy raises when a sergeant suggests redesigning its primary weapon system using scrap metal and welding equipment. But the casualties continued to mount, and the hedgerows continued to stop the advance, and Curtis Culin had one critical advantage: he was absolutely right. The first prototype was built in a field behind the regimental command post on July 30th. A maintenance sergeant named William Donovan, who had worked as a welder in a Pittsburgh steel mill, did the actual fabrication. They used 4 sections of German steel obstacle, each about 6 feet long, cut and shaped to angle slightly upward like the tusks of a wild boar. The pieces were welded directly to the Sherman's lower glacis plate, the sloped armor at the front of the hull. The entire modification took about 3 hours and used materials that had been lying in a ditch. No requisition forms were filed. No technical drawings were submitted to the Ordnance Department. Curtis Culin simply pointed at the German steel, pointed at his tank, and told Sergeant Donovan what he needed. The test took place the following morning in a section of bocage that had already been cleared of German forces. Culin's modified Sherman approached a typical Norman hedgerow, about 7 feet high and thick with brambles and centuries of compacted earth. The standard procedure would have required the tank to climb the obstacle, exposing its belly for at least 5 seconds. Instead, Culin drove straight at the hedgerow at a moderate speed. The steel prongs bit into the earthen wall, the Sherman's engine roared, and the tank punched through the hedgerow like a fist through wet cardboard, emerging on the other side in less than 3 seconds, with its hull level and its guns immediately ready to fire. The watching officers were silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone was talking at once. Within 24 hours, Curtis Culin's field modification had been observed by General Bradley himself. Within 48 hours, every maintenance company in the First Army had been ordered to begin fabricating what were now being officially called Culin hedgerow cutters, or simply rhino tusks. Within a week, more than 500 Sherman tanks had been equipped with the devices. The Battle of Normandy, stalled for 6 weeks against the hedgerows, was about to become something entirely different. But the innovation that would come to define American armoured warfare in the European theatre was not Curtis Culin's alone, and it was not limited to his hedgerow cutter. The summer of 1944 saw an explosion of field modifications to the M4 Sherman, each one born from the same desperate creativity that had produced the Rhino device. American tank crews, facing an enemy with superior weapons and defensive advantages, had begun to modify their vehicles in ways that would have horrified the engineers at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, but which made perfect sense to men whose lives depended on their tank's ability to survive and fight. The most common modification involved armor. The Sherman's frontal armor was approximately 2 inches thick, sloped at an angle to improve its effective thickness against incoming fire. This was adequate protection against most German anti-tank guns at medium ranges, but it offered no defense whatsoever against the 88mm guns mounted on Tiger and Panther tanks, or against the handheld Panzerfaust rockets that German infantry used with devastating effectiveness in close combat. The official response to this problem was to develop better armor for future tank models. The unofficial response, developed by men who needed protection immediately and could not wait for future models, was to add more armor themselves. Tank crews scavenged additional steel from destroyed vehicles, from German fortifications, from bombed-out buildings, and from the thousands of tons of debris that littered every battlefield. This steel was cut into plates and welded onto vulnerable areas of the Sherman's hull and turret. The tracks from destroyed tanks were often draped over the front and sides of operational vehicles, providing additional protection against shaped charge weapons. Sandbags were piled onto engine decks and fenders, offering modest protection against artillery fragments and small arms fire. Some crews welded concrete onto their tanks, mixing the concrete on-site and pouring it into wooden forms attached to the hull. The results were not elegant, and they added considerable weight to vehicles that were already struggling with mechanical reliability, but they worked. A Sherman tank commander named Lieutenant Robert Early, serving with the 3rd Armored Division near St. Lo, kept a detailed journal of his crew's modifications during August of 1944. His entries provide a glimpse into the systematic way American tankers approached the problem of improving their vehicles' survivability. On August 3rd, Early's crew welded sections of German track onto the Sherman's frontal armor, adding approximately 3 inches of additional steel protection. On August 7th, they attached steel plates salvaged from a destroyed German Panzer IV to the turret sides. On August 12th, they applied concrete mixed with steel fragments to the lower hull, creating a crude but effective defense against Panzerfaust rockets. By the end of the month, Early's Sherman had gained nearly 4 tons of additional weight and looked, in his words, like something built by a committee of welders who couldn't agree on anything except that more steel was better than less. The modifications were not without cost. The additional armor reduced the Sherman's already modest speed and placed enormous strain on the transmission and suspension systems. Tanks that had been capable of traveling at 25 miles per hour on roads now struggled to maintain 15. The added weight on the front of the hull, particularly from the Rhino devices and welded armor plates, increased ground pressure and made the tanks more prone to becoming stuck in soft ground. Mechanical breakdowns became more frequent as engines and transmissions labored under loads they had never been designed to carry. The Sherman's designers had carefully calculated weight distributions and stress loads, and now their calculations were being ignored by men who understood that a slower, mechanically unreliable tank was still preferable to a faster tank that burned when hit. What the official reports called unauthorized field modifications, and what the crews simply called necessary improvements, spread through the American armored divisions like a technical wildfire. Each unit developed its own variations and refinements. The 2nd Armored Division favored a version of the Rhino device that used 4 prongs arranged in a fork pattern. The 3rd Armored Division preferred 6 shorter prongs arranged in 2 rows. Some units welded spare track sections onto the prongs themselves, creating serrated edges that cut through hedgerow roots more effectively. Other units added steel plates behind the prongs to protect the hull welds from stress fractures. The diversity of designs reflected the fact that no central authority was directing or coordinating the modifications. Instead, thousands of tank crews were independently solving the same problems, sharing solutions through informal networks, and constantly refining their approaches based on combat results. The German response to these modifications reveals how significantly they affected the tactical balance in Normandy. German after-action reports from August 1944 began noting the appearance of what they called Nashorn-Panzer, or rhinoceros tanks, German anti-tank crews, who had grown accustomed to the predictable behavior of standard Shermans at hedgerows, found themselves facing tanks that burst through obstacles without warning and without exposing vulnerable belly armor. The carefully prepared ambush positions that had been so effective in July became death traps in August as modified Shermans punched through hedgerows and opened fire before German gunners could adjust their aim. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical impact. German defenders could no longer rely on the bocage terrain to slow American armor, and the steady, methodical advance that had characterized the Normandy campaign suddenly became a fluid, aggressive assault. But Curtis Cullen's innovation and the armor modifications that followed were not the only examples of American ingenuity transforming the Sherman tank during the summer of 1944. In the industrial cities of the northeastern United States, far from the combat zones of France, a parallel transformation was taking place that would prove equally important to the Sherman's effectiveness against German heavy armor. The Ford Motor Company plant in Dearborn, Michigan, had been producing Sherman tanks since 1942 as part of the massive industrial mobilization that had turned American automobile manufacturers into weapons producers. By the summer of 1944, Ford and other manufacturers had produced more than 40,000 Sherman tanks in various configurations, a production achievement that dwarfed anything the Germans could accomplish. But quantity alone was not solving the problem of German armor superiority. What was needed was a Sherman that could actually fight Tiger and Panther tanks on something approaching equal terms, and that meant a better gun. The standard 75mm gun mounted on most Shermans had been adequate when the tank was designed in 1941. It could defeat the frontal armor of German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks at combat ranges, and its high explosive shells were effective against infantry and fortifications. But the appearance of Tiger and Panther tanks in Tunisia in late 1942 and their increasing numbers on the eastern and western fronts had rendered the 75mm gun obsolete for anti-tank work. American tank crews had known this since Sicily. The question was whether anything could be done about it without completely redesigning the Sherman, a process that would take years and would interrupt the production of the one tank that America could build in sufficient numbers to win the war. The solution came not from tank designers, but from anti-aircraft artillery engineers. The United States had developed a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun designated the M5, intended primarily for shooting down high-altitude bombers. This gun had a high muzzle velocity and excellent armor penetration characteristics, but it was not particularly effective in its designed role because bombers rarely flew within its engagement envelope. In early 1944, a team of engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland proposed adapting the M5 anti-aircraft gun for use in tanks. The resulting weapon, designated the 76mm gun M1, was not actually 76mm in caliber. It was 3 inches, the same as the anti-aircraft gun from which it was derived. The designation 76mm was chosen deliberately to distinguish it from the older 75mm gun and to avoid confusion in supply chains and fire control systems. The 76mm gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther tank at ranges up to 1,000 yards and could defeat a Tiger I frontal armor at ranges under 800 yards, assuming the shot struck a vulnerable point and the ammunition used was the newer armor-piercing capped ballistic cap rounds that were just becoming available. These were not overwhelming advantages, but they were real advantages, and they gave Sherman crews something they had not possessed before: the ability to fight German heavy tanks without relying entirely on maneuver, superior numbers, and luck. The first Shermans mounting the 76mm gun arrived in Normandy in late July 1944, just as the hedgerow crisis was reaching its peak. These tanks, designated M4A 176mm, were immediately recognizable by their longer guns and slightly redesigned turrets. Tank commanders who had been fighting with 75mm Shermans requested the new vehicles with an urgency that reflected their desperate desire for any edge against German armor. But the arrival of the 76mm Shermans revealed an unexpected problem, one that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with human psychology and institutional inertia. Many American tank crews did not want the 76mm gun. They preferred to keep their 75mm weapons. The reason for this preference, which seemed inexplicable to commanders who were trying to field more capable anti-tank weapons, was rooted in the actual combat experience of tank crews in the bocage. The 76mm gun fired a heavier, faster projectile that was excellent for penetrating armor, but less effective at firing high-explosive shells against infantry and fortifications. In the hedgerow fighting, American tanks spent far more time engaging German infantry, machine gun nests, and anti-tank gun positions than they did fighting other tanks. The 75mm gun, with its superior high-explosive shell, was often more useful in day-to-day combat than the armor-piercing capability of the 76mm weapon. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This preference for the 75mm gun highlights a critical disconnect between what higher commanders thought tank crews needed and what tank crews actually needed for the missions they were assigned. The psychological trauma of facing Tiger tanks was real and significant, but the daily reality of combat in Normandy involved far more encounters with German infantry armed with Panzerfaust rockets than encounters with German heavy armor. A Sherman crew might go weeks without seeing a Tiger tank, but would face Panzerfaust armed infantry multiple times every day. In that environment, a gun that could blast apart a German machine gun nest or destroy a fortified building was more valuable than a gun that could, theoretically, penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor under ideal conditions. The compromise that eventually emerged reflected the practical wisdom of experienced combat soldiers. Tank platoons in the American armored divisions began to mix 75mm and 76mm Shermans, typically fielding 3 75mm tanks for general combat and 2 76mm tanks for anti-armor work. This mix allowed platoons to handle both the common threats they faced daily and the less common but terrifying threat of German heavy armor. It was not a solution that would have satisfied a theorist concerned with optimal anti-tank capability. but it was a solution that worked for the men who actually had to fight the war. Yet even as American tank crews modified their Shermans and adjusted to new weapons, they remained acutely aware that they were fighting with inadequate equipment against a technologically superior enemy. This awareness created a psychological burden that shaped every aspect of armoured combat in the European theatre. Knowing that the enemy's tanks were better than yours, that your armour could not protect you from their guns while their armour could protect them from yours, created a persistent anxiety that no amount of courage or training could completely overcome. The memoirs and letters of American tank crewmen from this period return again and again to the same themes: fear of the Tiger, frustration with the Sherman's weaknesses, and a grim determination to win through superior numbers, tactics, and individual skill what could not be won through superior technology. These men understood, with a clarity that their commanders sometimes lacked, that they were being asked to fight a technically superior enemy using technically inferior weapons, and that their survival depended on their ability to offset that technical inferiority through cleverness, aggression, and coordination. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armoured Division, later wrote a controversial memoir titled Death Traps that described the Sherman as a fundamentally flawed vehicle that unnecessarily cost American lives. Cooper's criticisms were sharp and personal, rooted in his experience of recovering destroyed Shermans and identifying the remains of their crews. He argued that American tank crews were betrayed by a procurement system that prioritized production numbers over combat effectiveness, and that the Sherman's deficiencies were known and understood, but never adequately addressed, because fixing them would have disrupted the industrial production that was America's primary advantage. Cooper's critique has been debated by historians for decades. Some argue that he overstated the Sherman's flaws and understated its advantages, particularly its mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance. Others point out that no Allied tank in production in 1944 could match the German Tiger or Panther in a direct engagement, and that the Sherman was actually superior to most of its Allied counterparts. The British Churchill tank, for example, was more heavily armoured but painfully slow. The Soviet 34 was fast and well armoured, but mechanically crude and difficult to maintain. In the universe of possible Allied tanks, the Sherman represented a reasonable balance of competing requirements: adequate armour, adequate firepower, excellent reliability, and above all, the ability to be produced in enormous numbers. But these historical debates miss the essential point that defined the experience of American tank crews in Normandy. Those crews were not comparing the Sherman to hypothetical alternatives or to Soviet tanks they had never seen. They were comparing it to the Tiger and Panther tanks they faced in combat, and by that comparison, the Sherman was inadequate. The modifications they made to their tanks, from Curtis Culin's hedgerow cutters to the scavenged armour plates welded onto hulls and turrets, were attempts to bridge the gap between the tank they had and the tank they needed. These modifications could not make a Sherman equal to a Tiger, but they could make a Sherman more survivable, more versatile, and more effective within the tactical role it was actually assigned. The breakthrough from the Normandy hedgerows finally came in late July 1944, with Operation Cobra, a massive offensive designed to rupture the German defensive line and allow American armour to break into the open country of central France. The operation began with a devastating aerial bombardment that pulverized German positions along a narrow front. Then the modified Sherman tanks, equipped with their Rhino devices and improvised armour, punched through the hedgerows that had contained them for 6 weeks. The German defensive line, weakened by the bombardment and unable to channel American armour into prepared killing zones, collapsed within days. What followed was one of the most spectacular armoured advances of the war. American tank columns raced across France, covering in days distances that had taken weeks to traverse in Normandy. The German army in France, unable to establish a coherent defensive line, was cut off and destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By early September, American forces had reached the German border. The campaign that had seemed stalled and hopeless in July had become a triumphant vindication of American armor and American ingenuity. But the cost of that triumph was measured in destroyed tanks and dead crewmen. The 2nd Armored Division, which had entered Normandy with 232 Sherman tanks, lost 179 of those tanks to enemy action between June and September 1944. The 3rd Armored Division's losses were similar. These statistics do not include tanks that were damaged and repaired, or tanks that broke down from mechanical failure and the stress of carrying improvised armor modifications. They represent only tanks that were completely destroyed, most of them by German anti-tank weapons, against which even modified armor offered inadequate protection. The human cost was harder to quantify but more terrible. A Sherman crew consisted of 5 men, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and an assistant driver who also operated the hull machine gun. When a Sherman was penetrated by enemy fire, the results were often catastrophic. The 75mm ammunition stored inside the tank would cook off in the heat, causing secondary explosions. The gasoline engine, despite improvements made to fuel systems after early models proved dangerously flammable, could still ignite. Crews had, on average, 30 seconds to evacuate a burning Sherman before the fire reached the ammunition storage. Men who moved quickly and kept their escape hatches clear might survive. Men who were wounded, or trapped, or simply unlucky, died in ways that were difficult to record in official casualty reports and impossible to forget for those who witnessed them. The modifications that men like Curtis Culin developed were attempts to reduce these casualties, to give Sherman crews a better chance of survival in a vehicle that was fundamentally outmatched by the enemy's best weapons. In this effort, they were partially successful. The Rhino devices reduced casualties by allowing tanks to cross hedgerows quickly without exposing vulnerable belly armor. The improvised armor plates stopped some shots that would otherwise have penetrated. The mixed platoons of 75mm and 76mm Shermans gave units better capability against both common and uncommon threats. These were real improvements that saved real lives. But they were also inadequate, and the men who developed them knew they were inadequate. Curtis Culin's hedgerow cutter was a brilliant solution to a specific tactical problem, but it could not solve the fundamental issue of German armor superiority. A Sherman with a Rhino device was still a Sherman, still vulnerable to 88mm guns, still unable to reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. The field modifications that spread through the American armored divisions in the summer of 1944 were acts of creative desperation by men who understood that they had to fight with the weapons they possessed, not the weapons they wished they possessed. The official recognition of Curtis Culin's contribution came slowly and incompletely. He was eventually awarded the Legion of Merit for his development of the hedgerow cutter, a decoration that recognized significant achievement, but was far below the level of Medal of Honor or even Distinguished Service Cross. The citation described his innovation as materially contributing to the success of operations in Normandy, which was bureaucratic language for probably saved hundreds of lives and helped win a battle. Culin himself seems to have been ambivalent about the recognition. He had developed the hedgerow cutter not to win medals, but to solve a problem that was killing his friends, and by that measure, the recognition was beside the point. The broader legacy of the field modifications developed in Normandy was more significant than any individual decoration. The American military's willingness to accept and encourage these unauthorized modifications represented a fundamental shift in institutional culture. In earlier eras, modifications to issued equipment were often prohibited or punished as violations of supply, discipline, and maintenance protocols. But in Normandy, faced with equipment that was clearly inadequate for the mission, the army chose pragmatism over protocol. Maintenance officers were ordered to support field modifications. Supply officers were directed to provide materials. Engineers were sent to study the most effective designs and help standardize them. This institutional flexibility, This willingness to learn from the improvised solutions of ordinary soldiers became one of the American military's significant advantages in the later stages of the war. The Kompanie, German military, despite its reputation for technical superiority and tactical innovation, proved far less adaptable. German tank crews were generally prohibited from making unauthorized modifications to their vehicles. When field modifications were made, they were typically limited and required approval from higher headquarters. This rigidity had some advantages. It maintained standardized maintenance procedures and simplified logistics, but it also meant that German tank crews could not respond as quickly or as creatively to tactical challenges. The contrast between American Shermans covered in improvised armor and modified with field-fabricated devices, and German Tigers maintained in their factory-standard configuration, reflected a deeper difference in military culture. By late 1944, as American forces approached the German border, the Sherman tank had evolved significantly from its original design. The vehicle that had been intended as a mass-produced, mechanically reliable, adequately armed medium tank had become something more complex and more capable. The addition of hedgerow cutters, improvised armor, and improved main guns had transformed the Sherman into a family of related vehicles, each adapted to specific tactical requirements. Some Shermans were optimized for breakthrough operations in close terrain, others were configured for long-range anti-tank work. Still others were stripped of their turrets and converted into recovery vehicles, command vehicles, or armored personnel carriers. This proliferation of variants and modifications created enormous logistical challenges. Maintenance crews had to stock parts for multiple gun types, armor configurations, and field modifications. Supply officers had to track which units had which variants and ensure that ammunition, repair parts, and specialized tools reached the right locations. The standardization that had made the Sherman relatively easy to maintain and support in its original configuration had been sacrificed to the need for tactical effectiveness. But this sacrifice was accepted because the alternative continuing to field tanks that crews believed were inadequate was not sustainable. The final months of the war in Europe saw the introduction of newer Sherman variants that incorporated some of the lessons learned from field modifications. The M4A3E8, known as the Easy 8, featured improved suspension, better armor, and a 76mm gun as standard equipment. The design included mounting points for armored applique plates that could be added in the field, essentially officializing what tank crews had been doing unofficially for months. The Easy 8 was widely considered the best Sherman variant produced during the war, and while it still could not match a Tiger or Panther in direct combat, it was a significantly more capable vehicle than the Shermans that had landed in Normandy. But by the time Easy 8s reached Europe in significant numbers, the strategic situation had changed. The German military was collapsing under the weight of a two-front war and systematic aerial bombardment. Fuel shortages immobilized German armor. Replacement crews were poorly trained. The Tiger and Panther tanks that had dominated battlefields in 1943 and 1944 were increasingly abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts, or destroyed by Allied fighter bombers before they could reach the front lines. The technical superiority that had given German armor such an advantage was becoming irrelevant as Germany's industrial base and logistical infrastructure collapsed. In this final phase of the war, the Sherman's advantages became decisive. American tanks could be maintained with parts that were readily available. They could be fueled with gasoline that Allied logistics networks provided in abundance. They could be repaired quickly in field workshops using standardized procedures. Crews could be trained on Shermans in the United States and transition smoothly to the same vehicles in combat. These prosaic advantages, reliability, maintainability, availability, mattered more in the long run than the superior firepower and armor of German heavy tanks that could not be kept running. The story of Curtis Coulin's hedgerow cutter and the field modifications that followed is not primarily a story about technology. It is a story about human creativity under pressure, about the ability of ordinary people to solve extraordinary problems when institutional solutions are inadequate or slow to arrive. Kulin was not an inventor or an engineer in any formal sense. He was a tank commander who paid attention to his environment, recognized a problem, and conceived a solution using materials at hand. His innovation worked not because it was elegant or sophisticated, but because it directly addressed a real tactical need in a way that could be implemented immediately. The thousands of American tank crewmen who modified their Shermans during the summer of 1944 were engaged in a similar process of practical problem-solving. They were not trying to build perfect tanks. They were trying to survive long enough to complete their missions. The armor they welded onto their vehicles was crude and heavy. The devices they fabricated were often ugly and irregular, but these modifications worked well enough, and in combat, well enough can be the difference between life and death. The broader lesson of Normandy's modified Shermans speaks to a fundamental truth about warfare that transcends any specific battle or weapon system. Wars are not won solely by the side with the best equipment or the most advanced technology. They are won by the side that can best combine adequate technology with superior numbers, better logistics, more effective training, and the flexibility to adapt to circumstances. The Sherman tank, despite its inadequacies, exemplified this principle. It was good enough to be, produced in vast numbers, reliable enough to be maintained under field conditions, and versatile enough to be modified for diverse tactical roles. American tank crews made it work because they had no choice, and in making it work, they demonstrated a form of ingenuity that was itself a weapon. Curtis Cullen survived the war and returned to New Jersey, where he resumed his civilian life with little public recognition for his contribution to the Allied victory. The hedgerow cutters that bore his name, though they were often called simply rhino devices, were removed from most Shermans after the breakout from Normandy, as the open terrain of central France and Germany made them unnecessary. The improvised armor that tank crews had welded onto their vehicles was eventually cut away during depot-level maintenance as peacetime standards reasserted themselves and the urgency of combat modifications faded. By the time Sherman tanks returned to the United States for display in military museums, most showed no trace of the field modifications that had been essential to their combat effectiveness. Yet the legacy of those modifications persists in military doctrine and institutional memory. The American military's acceptance of field innovation, its willingness to empower junior personnel to solve tactical problems through improvisation, became a permanent feature of how American forces approach warfare. Modern combat vehicles include mounting points and standardized interfaces specifically designed to accept field modifications and mission-specific equipment. Maintenance doctrine explicitly encourages adaptation to local conditions. This flexibility, this pragmatic acceptance that the weapons produced in factories may need to be modified by the people who use them in combat, traces its roots to the hedgerows of Normandy and to men like Curtis Cullen, who refused to accept that a problem was unsolvable simply because the official solution had not yet arrived. The Sherman tank of 1945, bristling with modifications and improvements developed through hard experience, bore little resemblance to the Sherman tank of 1942. It was a better tank not because its designers had perfected it, but because its users had refused to accept its limitations. They had seen what needed to be changed, and they had changed it, using whatever materials and expertise they could find. In doing so, they transformed an adequate tank into a capable one, and they transformed themselves from operators of issued equipment into active participants in the development of the weapons they wielded. The morning of July 28, 1944, when Curtis Cullen watched a French blacksmith cut German steel and conceived an idea that would help win a battle, was not the beginning of American armor superiority. It was, instead, a recognition that superiority could be achieved through means other than designing the perfect weapon. It could be achieved through practical innovation, through the systematic exploitation of available resources, and through the determined creativity of people who refused to be limited by the tools they were given. The story of the modified Sherman is the story of that recognition, and its consequences shaped not just a battle or a campaign, but the fundamental character of how America would fight its wars in the decades that followed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.